How we doing, everyone? Welcome to the week of carbohydrates, fiber, and the microbiome. I wanted to start out with a video diving into carbohydrates and how to look at them through a new lens here. Now, we talked about proteins and fats the last 2 weeks, and carbohydrates will round out our list of the 3 macronutrients. All food that we consume is comprised of these 3 macronutrients in different ratios. Now, we said that proteins and fats are both building blocks of all cells within our body. Because of that, we have to get different components of them in our diet. So for proteins, we had 9 essential amino acids, if you recall, from week 2 that we need to get in our diet. Last week with fats, there's 2 essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. Now, we get plenty of omega-6 in our standard American diet, but not enough omega-3s. So last week we focused on bringing in omega-3s. Now, carbohydrates are not a building block of our cells within our body. So because of that, there is no essential carbohydrates we need to consume to function properly. But carbohydrates do have a role within us and a healthy role within our body. And the primary role is of energy production. Now, at their simplest form, carbohydrates are made of sugar molecules. Glucose and fructose are the 2 most basic molecules. If you remember, proteins are made up of amino acids, fats are made up of fatty acids, and carbohydrates are made up of sugars. Now, let's take a look at some of the different specifics with carbohydrates. Now, where are carbohydrates found? Carbohydrates are found in our plant-based foods. They're not really in any of our animal-based foods. You know, maybe there's a couple carbs in eggs, actually, but nothing of significance. So we're looking at our plant-based foods for carbohydrates. At their core, I said they're made of sugars, but they also have a fiber component, and we'll dive into those 2 components next, fiber and sugar. And remember, carbs are a hot topic of diet theory these days, but they're neither good nor bad by themselves. But the different types of carbohydrates are certainly beneficial or burdensome on our body. So refined carbohydrates are typically part of the refining process, become stripped of their nutrients. This is done for maximizing shelf life so they don't go bad, and for texture and taste components. So let's dive into the fiber aspect of carbohydrates. Now, where does fiber come from? Fiber is actually part of the structure of the cell. So it forms the structural support of the plant cell walls. There's 2 types of fiber, soluble and insoluble, and that has to do with whether or not they are dissolved in water. Fiber slows the digestion of the sugars contained within these plant foods, which helps contribute to a more stable blood sugar level. And that's something that we've said on our basics and is a foundation of health, is stable blood sugar levels. Fiber does not get fully digested and absorbed into our body, but it does get consumed by our microbiome in the large intestine. The microbiome is made up of almost millions of different types of bacteria, and we're going to dive in our next video into the microbiome and how it's a beneficial part of health. But for now, we'll just know that fiber helps feed our microbiome and keeps it healthy and diverse. Fiber also adds bulk to our stools and can add moisture to our stools. And typically, the standard American diet, we get less than half of the recommended dietary allowance of fiber intake, which is 14 grams per 1,000 calories consumed. You know, so for myself, I consume more like 3,000 calories a day. So we're talking about almost 50 grams of fiber I should be getting. refer back to kind of reading labels. You know, we've talked about reading labels now and the nutrition facts to track our protein. We're talked about looking at eliminating seed oils. And now we might want to pay a little bit of attention to fiber. I don't count my fiber. I just make sure I stick to whole grains and complex carbohydrates, and I know I'm getting enough. Now let's jump over to the sugars. So sugars, one of the main components of what carbohydrates are made of and what makes them controversial. The two main sugars, the two most simplest forms of sugars found in carbohydrates are glucose and fructose. Once we consume these carbohydrates, whether it is a sugary drink, a piece of bread, or a bowl of brown rice or quinoa, once it's digested, it gets absorbed in the small intestine and enters our blood as glucose. This raises our blood sugar levels and stimulates a response from the body to release the hormone insulin. Insulin's main job is to maintain stable blood sugar levels because high blood sugar levels are toxic to the body. Now, if glucose is not immediately used for energy in our bloodstream, insulin's job is to store the glucose away. The first way that sugar is stored in our body is it's transformed to glycogen, and it's stored in our muscle tissue and our liver. This glycogen is our immediate source of energy in the body. Once all of our glycogen stores in our muscles and liver are full, though, and we need to bring our sugar levels down still, the insulin then will shuttle the blood sugar, the glucose, to the liver, which transforms it into triglycerides. These triglycerides are then stored in our adipose fat tissue. This is how eating carbohydrates can get turned into fat if we're not using them as a fuel source, or if we're not using them to refill our fuel source. Now, moderate to intense exercise or going a prolonged period without food, fasting, are the best ways to empty these stores of glycogen from our muscle and our liver to make room to receive the next round of blood sugar. And really having available glycogen storage room is the best way for us to maintain stable blood sugar levels. Now let's take a little graph here. I stole this graph and I copied the website in here to give them credit from ihealthlabs.com. Just a quick graph showing blood sugar levels after consuming different types of carbohydrates. Now, the dotted green line shows where we want to keep our blood sugar levels within. The initial line, the red line there, is something that you're eating a very refined carbohydrate, a sugary drink, a fruit juice, that you see a very high spike in blood sugar levels. However, that stimulates a very high release of insulin. That insulin then stores the blood sugar and typically has an overreactive reaction. And as it's trying to rebalance your blood sugar levels, you see that it dips below the optimal blood sugar level. This results in us feeling run down, tired, annoyed, low kind of patience levels. That's the crash. The sugar crash is our blood sugar dropping and giving us now low energy. You can see the second yellow line is from something that's a white refined carbohydrate. So not like a liquid sugar, a direct sugar source, but something that doesn't take long for your body to turn into sugar and break down and turn into sugar. Like a white bread, white rice, white pasta, your breakfast cereal, that kind of thing. Now, the final blue line shows our complex carbohydrates, and it shows a very slow rise in blood sugar that never quite spikes out of the right zone, and then also a nice level decline that doesn't crash and leave us feeling tired. Now, why is this? The third video that we're going to jump into this week is going to be talking about digestion and some of the basics of digestion and how our body works. But because of that fiber, if you remember the plant cell and the structure, it takes time for our body to break that down and access the sugar within that plant food that we're eating. That's why it takes longer for our blood sugar to react, and it's a slower reaction within our blood sugar when we eat a complex carbohydrate, because our body has to work a little bit harder and it takes longer to break it down. But that helps contribute to motility and healthy movement of the food through our body. These processed carbohydrates have the fiber removed, and so it doesn't take as long for our body to break it down into its simplest sugar molecule and be absorbed into our bloodstream. That results in these blood sugar spikes, and it results in a cascade of health issues. So let's look at some key points. We just want to focus on our complex carbohydrates. We don't want to be afraid of carbohydrates, but we want to focus on the right kinds of carbohydrates. The complex carbohydrates we're talking about are whole grains, sweet potatoes, yams, oats, legumes, which are beans, quinoa, barley, brown rice, wild rice, different whole grain rices. Lentils are a fantastic one. And then our vegetables, broccoli, greens, carrots, cucumbers, peppers, all of those. Now, fruits and white potatoes, still complex carbohydrates, but contain a little bit less fiber than some of the foods listed above. So they do get absorbed a little bit quicker than some of those initial complex carbohydrates I said above. So I'll typically limit my hand fruit to 1 serving a day, and my white potatoes, I'll just make sure that that's not usually what I'm leaning on. I'm usually getting some different potatoes, but a serving of them is not the end of the world, especially if you're exercising. Now, we want to limit our processed carbohydrates. Sugary drinks and juices, I never touch them. Beware of sugary fruit juice-based drinks and smoothies that are labeled as health foods, but sometimes have up to 50 grams of sugar in them. That is a ton of sugar. I'm talking about the naked juices, Odwalla juices that are in the health aisles. They're labeled as a health drink. They have a tremendous amount of sugar, but they have no fiber in them. So it spikes our blood sugar, even though it's labeled as a health food. I don't touch any of those ever. Breads, pastas, and sweet treats, breakfast cereal, chips, crackers, all examples of processed carbohydrates that have little to no nutrient value into them. So they're not supportive at all, but they do have a burden on regulating our blood sugar, filling our glycogen stores, and putting a burden on our liver. So they're burdensome foods. I very rarely eat those foods. Now, whole grain bread and whole grain pastas, they are a better choice than breads and pasta, than white bread and white pastas. But I still limit any kind of usage of those. And remember too, we're looking for a 1 cup serving if we are using a pasta or a bread there, not filling our plate with pasta. We want to fill our plate with our protein and our vegetables, and then have a side serving of these complex carbohydrates. Out of all of these processed carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup is 100% the worst. It puts an extra burden on our liver to be processed, and it can't just be immediately absorbed into our muscle cells as glycogen if there's room in there. So high fructose corn syrup is the number 1 processed carbohydrate that I'm going to make sure I eliminate, and then I work my way from there. Key point number 3 when it comes to carbohydrates: exercise is a super powerful tool, and it'll give your body a little bit of leeway when you do eat these carbohydrates or some of the processed carbohydrates. Exercise will empty our glycogen stores, and it'll just ready the body to take on a little bit more glycogen, a little bit more glucose in the next meal. It has a very large impact on if your blood sugar is going to spike or not, is whether or not your glycogen stores are ready to take on more sugar. So remember, a little bit of exercise, the more exercise you do, the more carbohydrates you can afford. So I'll limit my carbohydrates, my complex carbohydrates, like my whole grains, to 1 or 2 portions a day. If I'm doing excessive exercise, then I can eat a little bit more. I save my processed carbohydrates for the rare treat. I hope this helps you guys out. Looking forward to the microbiome one.